Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Wilson. I work for the City of Edina. I'm the Water Resources Coordinator. And tonight we're going to kick off a conversation about the Morningside Flood Infrastructure Project. Before we get into this conversation, I want to recognize where people might be coming from for this meeting today. There's a lot going on in the world right now with COVID-19, with the killing of George Floyd, with the unrest in the Twin Cities metro area. While those are conversations that really deserve a lot of space, and we don't have time to get into those conversations tonight with this meeting, I want to recognize that people are struggling with these things, and they might be bringing some of those feelings of fear, anxiety, anger, and sadness to the meeting today. So I just want to recognize where people might be coming from as they are attending this meeting tonight, which is focused on flooding. Flooding is another that can bring about some of those same emotions: fear, anxiety, anger, and sadness. So we recognize those emotions as we start another difficult conversation on top of a series of difficult conversations that we've been having over the past weeks and months. So with that, I want to welcome you to this virtual meeting today. There's another person on the meeting with me today that's going to help moderate the conversation and help me understand what questions are coming in through our Better Together webpage. So I want to introduce Patty.
Thanks, Jessica. My name is Patty Day, and I will be helping facilitate this meeting. Like Jessica said, this is a time for community to come together, and we do appreciate you taking your time to spend your evening with us and share your feedback. This is just the start of many conversations, and just a little bit of housekeeping as we get started. There will be the YouTube live stream. Chat has been disabled, so please make all of your comments through the Better Together comment page. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll collect all those comments and respond after the meeting if you don't get to your comment during the meeting. But please feel free to use that to ask questions, to ask for clarification, that sort of thing. And we'll have a Q&A at the end of the meeting as well. So think about what things that you might want us to expound on. With that, I'll give it back to Jessica.
Thank you. And just one more comment too, this meeting is being recorded. So if you're able to watch live, that's welcome. If you're watching this at a later time, welcome. And we're going to keep the opportunity to ask questions and submit survey responses and tell your story. We're going to keep those options open for some time, recognizing that not everyone may be able to attend the live meeting. And that activity, again, will be taking place on that bettertogetheredina.org/Morningside page. There'll be multiple opportunities to participate. Tonight is not the only opportunity to do so. So this is a shot of that Better Together Edina page for this specific project. So this is a good place to check back to get contact information for city staff, to submit questions, to have your questions answered, to get project updates, to tell us stories and let us know what's important to you in the neighborhood and how you use the park and the concerns that you have and issues that you've noticed related to flooding. We'll have a poll. We have a poll started now. We're going to leave that open for some time. And then as we come back with more information throughout this process, which is going to span several months, this is a good place to check back for that information. Some of the topics that we're going to cover tonight why are we here? What is it about the Morningside neighborhood that is bringing this project to it? A little bit of background about flooding, how it occurs, some flood reduction strategies and opportunities that we see at a high level right now, flooding resources that we've put together for residents to reduce their own exposure and vulnerability to flooding, the timeline for the project, and then next steps, which includes how you can get involved, how you can tell us your story, how you can share your concerns, ask questions, get more information on the project. And we've also set aside some time for questions and answers. And Patty's going to help me get some questions off of the Better Together page, and I can respond to those in the meeting tonight. If we don't get to all those questions, we will be responding to questions on the Better Together webpage as well. If it's something that we don't have an answer to right now, we'll get that information and we'll respond on the Better Together webpage. I want to lead off with Edina's flood risk reduction strategy. This is a strategy document that we worked on for over the last year, and a resident task force along with staff worked to put this strategy together. So there were 8 residents from all over the city of Edina, and they had experienced, they had a variety of experiences related to flooding. And they really helped us understand what flooding means to a resident and what their perception of the city's service is. And they really help shape that framework for how we understand risk, how we define risk. We took some technical dives and we explored what's causing increasing risk. And then we had some conversations that helped clarify the sectors of city work and how we can comprehensively reduce the risk for people throughout the community. And that ultimately is our strategy to comprehensively reduce risk throughout the community. So why are we here in the Morningside neighborhood with this flooding infrastructure project? There are some street reconstruction projects anticipated for 2022 and 2023 in this neighborhood. So there's an opportunity to explore infrastructure related options for managing flood risk. And this is the first project that will really engage a neighborhood to plan flood infrastructure under this new strategy. Through this project, at the end, we're going to make a recommendation to City Council. Staff's going to make a recommendation to the City Council on infrastructure options based on the engineering expertise of the staff and then the expertise of the neighborhood. We've brainstormed some engineering ideas at a high level. So we have a good sense for how much water we're talking about, general strategies, how far we can take those general strategies, what they cost. What we don't know is what the experience is of the people who live there and how you experience flooding, how that shapes your neighborhood, how the parks and streets are used, what your concerns or desires are for the neighborhood. So since you live there, or you recreate there, or you visit that space, you have a much more intimate sense of what flooding means for this neighborhood. So we want to take what you know about your neighborhood and what flooding means to you, and what we know from that engineering expertise and water resources management expertise to make a recommendation to council that makes sense for this neighborhood. So what we're asking you to do throughout this process is share your stories, share your concerns, share your values. Let us know what information in order to make some decisions. There are going to be some trade-offs. If this were a really simple problem to solve, then it would be a simple problem to solve. I think part of the struggle as we look at some general ideas is that a lot of them have trade-offs. And so we're asking the community to help us figure out what's the value here and how do we achieve some flood risk reduction that aligns with the values of the neighborhood. Through this flood risk reduction strategy task force process, we defined flooding. What is flooding? And there's a few different pathways that flooding occurs. Over the land surface, this is probably the most common or intuitive one that folks think about. But there's also groundwater seepage, water that fills over long periods of time when the ground is very, very wet, like it is more recently here in Minnesota. Groundwater can seep into basements through cracks and compromised foundations and cause problems in basements. So when it's wet for a long period of time, folks might notice that if they have a sump pump, that it's running more often, or if they have a subgrade basement, that it's wet when it wasn't always the case. And then the other type of flooding that occurs is sanitary backflow, and this happens when there's so much water on the surface, it gets into the sanitary sewer system, backs that up with water, and sanitary waste gets backed up into low structures and into folks' basements. This is a disruptive and frustrating thing. And so I think we hear that often, especially in really wet seasons, that this is a really frustrating thing. So people are looking for help with this issue. So we want to bring you some options from an infrastructure standpoint that can help. And then we also want to make sure that you're aware of the flood risk that you have, and then provide you with some resources so that you can take some actions to reduce exposure and vulnerability at your property. So what is a 1% annual chance? This is a little bit of background on what is flooding. And the 1% annual chance, some folks might refer to this as a 100-year flood, or if you've heard that term, 100-year flood. And we try to use the term 1% annual chance flood instead, because every year there's a chance that a flood of that size could happen. And we define the 1% annual chance flood as 7.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. The other reason we don't like to use the 100-year flood term is we don't want anyone to misinterpret that as, well, we had a 100-year flood, and so we're good for another 99 years. Every year there's a chance that a flood of that size can happen. So we looked at, in this specific neighborhood, we did some engineering analysis to figure out, how much water are we really here? And it's quite a bit. So if we have 7.5 inches of rain in this neighborhood in a 24-hour period, after we account for infiltration, water that soaks into the ground, and surface storage, water that's going to fill up in those surface ponds, that we still have quite a bit of water runoff and over 50 million gallons of runoff. So that would be equivalent to over 100 Southdale water towers. That's an incredible amount of runoff. And if you're thinking, 1%, that's a pretty small number. I'll roll the dice. 1%, how much is that? So we looked at, what's a 1 in 10 chance? So a 10% annual chance. So every year there'd be a 10% chance that flood could happen. That's 4.3 inches in 24 hours for this area. And that's still 25 million gallons. That's 50 Southdale water towers in this neighborhood. So even a more frequent event, like a 10% annual chance flood, is still quite a bit of water. It's pretty challenging to address all of that. So if you're thinking, what are the odds that a flood of this magnitude would happen to me? If you are in a 1% annual chance floodplain, the likelihood that you would experience that in a 30-year term, so a typical mortgage term, is at least 25%. If you're in a 10% annual chance floodplain, the likelihood that you would experience that event in a 30-year term is at least 95%. 2014, there was a big there was a big storm in June, and for that storm, there's a little over 4 inches in the 5 days preceding a big storm event where there was a little over 2 inches. There was a lot of flooding in that June 2014 event. In addition to it being a lot of water, some parts of the neighborhood are historically wetland. This is a map from the city of Edina. The title is An Ill-Drained Glaciated Area, part of Minneapolis, from 1908. And it shows a wetland area in that western portion of the Morningside neighborhood. As that neighborhood was developed, a lot of that area was drained to make way for development. It wasn't very conducive to infiltration or water soaking into the ground in the first place. So there's a lot of water fallen in this space. There's not a lot of ability for water to infiltrate. It has been drained to allow for development over many, many decades. So that's kind of why we're experiencing the magnitude of flooding that we are today. So how do we define flood risk? And there's 3 components. The first is climate. And when we talk about climate, we're referring to short-term weather patterns that we're seeing, seasonal trends, and then also long-term climate change risk. And climate change is increasing the extremes. We're seeing a lot more flooding, a lot more storm events that are larger in size. Exposure and vulnerability. Exposure is the degree to which a property comes into property, home, building, infrastructure, other asset comes into contact with floodwater. Vulnerability is how able that structure or asset is to resist flooding and resist damage. So you might have 2 structures that have similar exposure. They might be right next to each other, adjacent to a creek or a lake, but one might be less vulnerable if it has a sump pump and proper grading and gutter pointed in a proper place. So we want to get people aware of their exposure, and we have some tools that I'll demo for you today to help you understand your exposure, and then also some resources to reduce your vulnerability to that flooding if you are exposed. What's driving this increase in flood risk? Through our flood risk reduction strategy process, as we were developing that strategy with that resident task force, we did some analysis to help us answer that question of why is flood risk increasing? And the factor that was the biggest driver was by far climate change. And we invite you to take a look at the analysis that we had done. We have a flood risk reduction strategy posted to our Better Together webpage, and then also to our water resources library. So you can take a look at the technical studies that we did to help answer those questions. Climate change is the biggest driver. And then the next biggest driver would be aging infrastructure. A lot of the neighborhood was developed before modern, our better understanding of precipitation for this area and this time. So a lot of the infrastructure that was built in the 50s and 60s and 70s is obsolete at this point. So the biggest drivers of increasing flood risk are climate change and aging infrastructure. Other drivers, things that do matter, well-drained landscapes and imperviousness, those things are more historical drivers. So we're not seeing as much change in those today, but they certainly contributed to where we are at today. So modern drivers, climate change and aging infrastructure, some historical drivers, well-drained landscapes and imperviousness all get us to the point where we are today. So our strategy is to comprehensively reduce flood risk throughout the community. And in the Morningside neighborhood, because we have some anticipated roadway reconstruction projects coming up, there are some opportunities to look at some the infrastructure and to let people in on what their flood risk is and tools that they can use to increase their own resilience or to reduce their vulnerability and exposure. Through the strategy development process, we identified these city areas of work, and these are those: infrastructure, regulation, outreach and engagement, and emergency services. And so with this project, we can explore these approaches for infrastructure and outreach and engagement because we have this capital investment that is planned to occur already in 2022 and 2023 that provides that opportunity to explore those options. So what kind of things are we thinking about in the Morningside neighborhood? And we haven't made any decisions yet on what's going to get built there. I think we have some general ideas and we've brainstormed a little bit on options that can scale, that can be that can make a difference for flood risk reduction here. But the key part that we're missing, that we're hoping to get more information through this process, is from folks that visit and live and recreate in the neighborhood. So some high-level options that could work: storage in parks. That would be above ground. It might look like a pond, or below ground, might look like a big storage tank. Storage in streets. How much water are we comfortable with having in the street, above ground, or again, buried below ground in a tank? We could improve or optimize piping. We could leverage some predictive pumping where we pump water downstream at a time when before the flood happens, so that we don't get as much of that peak flood and flooding and damage at the peak of the flood. And very likely a combination of all of those things. So we have a good sense of how much water we're talking about. We have thought a little bit about how big these things need to be to scale, so essentially to start to make a difference. But we haven't made any decisions yet on those options, and we want to hear from the folks that live, recreate, and visit this neighborhood before we get too far down into our engineering design. So how can you find out what your flood risk is? We have a tool called the What is My Flood Risk Map, and it's on our flooding webpage. And on this webpage, you can search by address to get a sense for what your flood risk is at your property. So I invite everybody to visit this webpage, and I'll give you a tour of it at the end of the presentation slides here. And you might be surprised. I think when we were getting our updated modeling information, so our new information, updating with more modern information about the hills and valleys and the landscape, and then also precipitation. And we were surprised also to see where all the water was, and it was everywhere. There's a lot of it. So I invite you to take a look at this map and explore your neighborhood and your property and see what your flood risk is. And then there's, of course, information there that leads you to some other resources to, again, see what you can do to reduce your own exposure and vulnerability. On this webpage, we have some actions for flood resilient homes. While these things aren't going to solve flooding in the neighborhood, they have the potential to reduce exposure and vulnerability at a specific property. In addition to these fact sheets about different actions that you can take, staff is, of course, always available for technical assistance, and you can give us a call at any time, and we'd be happy to come out and take a look at your issue and your property and see what advice we can give you and help you find a solution for your problem. So when we start, yes?
Hi, this is Patty. If I may, we did get a question in the comments on Better Together, and I would again encourage everyone to leave comments there if they want clarification or if there's something they want us to follow up on. So we appreciate that. But we had a question about, and maybe you can address this, about imperviousness of material as being one of the reduction strategies and why it's what the impact of that is, and why with so much redevelopment in the Morningside neighborhood, how big of a factor is this in the flooding issues that we're seeing?
Yeah, we explored that. We asked that same question in our development of our flood risk reduction strategy. How much does impervious cover matter? And it turns out it makes a difference. But when we're talking about the 1% annual chance flood, the big event, the change in impervious has little impact. So and then we asked a question, if we were to really change the impervious cover that we have today, if we were to reduce a really large amount, 20% or 50%, could we see a big decrease in flood risk? And the answer was no. The analysis for that is in our flood risk reduction strategy in an appendix, and you can see all the analysis that we did and some graphics to show, it does change it, but by what amounts to be a really small amount. Then with climate change on top of that, with the increasing risk that we're seeing with climate change, any benefit that we would see by a massive reduction in impervious would quickly be taken over by the increase of water due to climate change. So that isn't a big storm, the 1% annual chance flood. Impervious cover matters much more in a smaller storm or a more frequent one. So if we're talking about the 2% annual chance, the storm that happens every year, every other year, here's the 1 inch rain, the 2 inch rain. Then impervious cover starts to matter a little bit at a really hyper local scale. So what's happening at the lot next door in a small event, changes to impervious can have more of an impact in those smaller storms than in the bigger storms. So things like rain barrels, rain gardens, properly directing gutters and downspouts, those things can provide a lot of good in those small storms and at that hyper-local scale. So those things, proper storm management is still really important. It matters much more at those really small storms that tend to be a little bit more frequent. When we're talking about the really big 1% annual chance flood, those things tend not to make much of a difference. So when we think about what are these things that we could, the options that we have at a high level, there's a range of costs. And we're not at the point where we're even ready to talk about costs for those yet. But we do have some good information about what kind of revenue we're generating for dealing with stormwater issues at this point. And so if we take all the Morningside housing units all of those housing units that we have, and the stormwater utility fee that each unit is paying per month, it's about $13. That generates about $2 million over 20 years. So $2 million in the when we're talking about engineering projects, infrastructure projects to manage floods, that's not a whole lot. So our reaction to that is we've got to get pretty creative and make sure that we're spending this money in the best way to get the best benefit. And we also want to make sure that those infrastructure options that we explore are things that the neighborhood can live with, and that the trade-offs for those infrastructure options are ones that the neighborhood can live with. So what does this project look like? And you might be asking yourself, how do I get involved? How do I tell my story? How do I ask my question? How do I submit my concern? So here we are at the beginning of this process with this virtual meeting. And in green here are the opportunities that you have to share some information with us and help us understand what it is that this neighborhood values and what we need to consider as we're looking through infrastructure options. Mid-June, we're planning a walkabout field activity. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. In the fall, we're going to present some initial concept ideas, and that's going to take some of that engineering expertise and combine it with the neighborhood expertise, that information that we're going to be collecting for the next many weeks here. And then we're going to get your reaction to those initial concepts, go back and refine those, and come back in winter 2020 with some refined concepts, and then ask for you to tell us what you think about those options again. We have a couple check-ins with our city council, with your city council. So we're going to give them a project update in the fall, and then in spring 2020, take the information from this process and a recommendation to city council so that they can make a decision on flood infrastructure options. And then after that, the engineering study on the road reconstruction process begins, and then construction is planned for 2022 and for a few streets, and then that finishes up in 2022, and then in 2023 on a different set of streets, construction starts in the spring and goes through the fall. So this is not the only option or opportunity to provide feedback. We want to hear from you throughout the summer, the fall, the winter. We'll come back a few times with some iterations, and we want you to help us refine those as we get to the point of making a recommendation to City Council. After they make a decision, we'll provide some, we'll tell you what the decision was.
Jessica, this is Patty again. I just wanted to make clear to folks that this timeline is available on the website, so this won't be the only opportunity for you to see that. We'll put this there, as well as this presentation, so that you can share with your neighbors, and also you can reference it throughout the project. This is a very transparent process, and we want to make sure you know where you can provide input so that that your voices can be heard and your input can be factored into future decisions. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that this timeline was going to be featured on the Better Together website where they tuned into this meeting today.
Great, thank you, Patty. So the next steps, join us on Better Together Edina. That's where you can sign up for project updates, leave comments. We have an interactive map where you can drop a pin and tell us, you know, how you use that space, or you can drop a pin and tell us what concerns you have about safety or flooding. Tell us your stories on that map. We have some surveys, options for you to provide some narrative, to ask questions, to get in contact with us. And like I said, staff is ready and available to meet with you and talk about your issue and understand your issue. And then we have some flooding resources and information, and I'll demo that a little bit more for you too in this after this presentation. So this is the walkabout activity. We've got this scheduled for mid-June, and this is a chance to get out into the Weber Park space and get a sense for where flooding would occur while you're out there. And there's going to be 7 steps along the way. We'll guide you through this activity, and at each stop, we'll let you know what to do. You can have fun while you learn about flooding and other flood infrastructure opportunities in that area. So here we're looking for a mid-June kickoff to that, and we'll update that on Better Together Edina. We recognize that not everyone has the ability to get out to the park to participate in that activity, so we're going to recreate that same opportunity online so that you can experience it regardless of your ability to get out to Weber Park. And with that, I'm going to take a break here and check in with Patty and answer some questions.
Thanks, Jessica. So people are wondering, are future meetings going to happen in person or will they be online? With everything that's going on, what can they expect in hearing from us and being able to participate in those different discussions?
Yeah, great question. At this point, we are anticipating all of our meetings to be done virtually. If the circumstances change such that we can have a public meeting in person and do it safely, we would like to do that. And if we are able to meet in person, we will still do a recording, and we will still make all of those options available also on Better Together Edina. We're going to do our best to replicate that experience so that even if you're unable to attend in person or choose not to attend in person, you still have that same experience, that same ability to provide feedback. Your comments and concerns would carry the same weight as someone who submitted those comments in person at an in-person meeting. So we're going to keep an eye on the situation, and if we can do an in-person meeting, we'll plan to.
So what I'm hearing, Jessica, is that folks can leave comments on the Better Together website. They can email you. They can take the survey, and they can hopefully show up at in-person things if they occur in the future, and public meetings online. So there's going to be a lot of different ways for people to share their feedback.
Yes. Yep, definitely. And I want to demo the Better Together site here where I think a lot of people are viewing this video from. So bettertogetheredina.org. There's a tile here for this specific project, Morningside Flood Infrastructure Project. And on this page, there's information about staff to reach out to them. We'll be updating with key dates as those come into focus. Right now we have some general schedule benchmarks. So when we're going to share information, when we're going to present initial concepts, as those come into focus, we'll provide specific dates. And then you can come here to watch those meetings live, or we'll preserve a recorded version here. And then all the questions that are asked here will stay here, and we'll provide responses to those. The poll, you'll have the ability to participate and then see the responses for those as we go. And then of course Q&A. There's this map feature here where you can click on this Morningside neighborhood map and you can add a pin. So if you had a safety concern somewhere in Weber Park, or you had a place where you love to play and you want to let us know where that is, we want to hear that. If there's a space where you've experienced flooding, let us know where that is too. We want to see how that syncs up with the flood risk model that we have and where we think those issues are occurring. So this is where you can select a pin, drop it somewhere in that neighborhood, wherever that's happening, and tell us a little bit about that. And then we also have, here's where you can ask a question and we'll respond to those. And then we also have an option where you can tell a story. So if you have something a little bit more narrative, or you just want us to know something, you can add that to this space. The other couple things I want to show you on this page, we have links to that interactive map, that flood risk map, which I will show you that here in a moment. Some of those resources for managing exposure and vulnerability at your property are on this flooding and drainage webpage. And then our Edina Water Resources Library is really where a lot of that task force, flood risk reduction strategy task force effort is. So all of our meeting materials and all of the things that were produced by that resident group are available there. And then some frequently asked questions. And as those come into focus too, we'll continue to add those as we figure out what folks are really curious about. So the other thing I want to show you before I check in with Patty on some more questions is this is our flooding and drainage webpage. And here we have a link to this interactive map. What is my flood risk interactive map? And when you open this map, you'll get a little bit of background information about what this map is intended to show. And then you can search for a specific property. And there's some information here about how to get more resources or connect with city staff, some definitions if you happen to be in a FEMA designated flood zone. So you can see the flood risk for different areas throughout the city, and you'll be able to determine if a property is in the 1% annual chance flood area, which would have which would be like a 7.5-inch rain in 24 hours, or like a 10% annual chance at 4.3 inches in a 24-hour period.
So Jessica, I just wanted to reiterate, there were some more specific questions. There are some very specific questions being asked on the Better Together site, and we appreciate that. We're going to need to follow up more specifically on those and put together some more comprehensive answers. And so I just want folks to know that we will be following up on those on the site with these individuals so that they know that we've registered their question and then we'll be getting a response, and then anyone can see what that response will be in the future. So we're trying to keep this at just like a high level so that everybody can take away what they need from it today, but we do intend to follow up and engage with residents individually on their specific questions if we need to go into a little bit more detail on that. So there's another question that came up, has to do with the construction issue and the construction part of this project, because it's dealing with infrastructure investments related to road reconstruction. So is there a list of streets that will have reconstruction each year, and where can residents go to find that?
Yes, we do have a resource for road reconstructions. If you want to know about specifically the ones that are in this neighborhood, on the interactive map, those streets that are up for reconstruction are shown here. So the orange lines represent roads that are planned for reconstruction in 2022. And the blue lines represent roads that are planned for reconstruction in 2023. If you're interested in other neighborhoods and other street projects, we do have a road reconstruction story map on our maps page on the City of Edina website. So you can go there and see throughout the city for the next 5 years which road reconstruction projects are planned.
Thanks, Jessica. So these streets that are highlighted, when you say reconstruction, can you give us a little bit more of an idea? Because I know there's different types of road work, repaving, resurfacing, reconstruction. Is this reconstruction is a more robust type of project, correct?
Yeah, great question. So the roadway reconstruction, those are where we do a full renewal. Uh, we look at the water utility, we look at sewer utility, we look at stormwater utility, we look at curb and gutter and pavement. And so for a road reconstruction project, these are pretty disruptive. So it tends to be the whole road is closed for a long period of time. The pavement in its entirety is removed. There's often a lot of getting down to the buried utilities, the water and sewer and storm sewer that are buried underneath, and assessing, evaluating, I should say, and renewing that infrastructure, and then so that those can continue to provide service for many decades into the future. And then at the end, that is ends up with some new pavement and and curb and gutter may or may not change. That's a little bit too far out for me to say at this point. So it is a full. It's probably the most transformative of any road style project. So this isn't the one where it's just kind of a little scraped off the top and then more is added. This is a full removal of the pavement, looking at those underground utilities, and then replacing with new pavement.
Thanks, Jessica. I think that is important to know, just in that the city is taking advantage of the opportunity, right? Since they're already, reconstructing the entire road, this would be the time to invest in that infrastructure so they don't have to come back and do something at a later date. And that's sort of why you guys are looking at this specific area right now. Is that fair to say?
Certainly, the most cost-effective way to do these types of projects are in conjunction with capital investments that are already being made, certainly. And it also is, a street lasts approximately 60 years. So this is also kind of a once in a 60-year chance to really get into the project. So that's also why this is a good opportunity to look at what options might suit this neighborhood right now with those street reconstructions. We also want to just get a sense of what the opportunities are. We foresee the opportunity to do some work in the streets, and some of it might not all just get built in 2022 and 2023. But we want to make sure that if something needs to happen with the street reconstruction, that it's in place and ready for that. We don't quite know yet where all the infrastructure might, where that recommendation might land. It might be in the streets, it might be partly in some park space, it might be a combination of that. So we just want to make sure that we don't lose an opportunity to do what we need to do in the streets while the streets are essentially open. But it also might be a phased approach where while the streets are open, we're going to do what we need to do with the street component. And then at a later future time, as opportunities or changes come up in perhaps Weber Park or Weber Woods, to make some changes there. And I also say that with there's currently no schedule or plan for like a master plan for Weber Park or Weber Woods. That has not occurred yet. And we haven't made any decisions yet about those places. Other than that, when Weber Woods was purchased, the city noted that that was to be a park and to have some recreational uses, including a dog park, and to be used for stormwater management. That's really the level of decisions that have been made for that space yet. So I think a lot of that is still kind of open, and we want to hear from people on what they think about, how they use that space or opportunities or concerns or uses for those spaces too.
Something else you talked about, Jessica, I thought was interesting. This is the pilot project then for looking at flood infrastructure for the city of Edina. Is that right? So this is the first place that these things are being looked at and resident input is being considered and might inform future decisions for the city elsewhere as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. So Morningside is not the only neighborhood that has flooding issues and flood risk. We see flood risk in many other places throughout the city of Edina. As although this is the first one to come, this road reconstruction here, where we can explore flood infrastructure options, we know that the needs are many and they spread across the city. So when we look at the strategy and what we're going to do and where and how much we're going to spend, we have to still consider that the needs are numerous and they're spread throughout the city. So how do we make sure that that we can that the work that we do in the Morningside neighborhood is something we can replicate in other neighborhoods throughout the city of Edina, as far as how we engage with people and what opportunities exist to reduce risk for people or help people understand their risk or take action to reduce their own vulnerability and exposure at their property.
Thanks, Jessica. Speaking of people, reducing risk at their own property, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some things that on a smaller scale that homeowners might do to reduce their risk and maybe not solve the problem, but maybe help with their own specific flooding issues. If you have any tips or anything that people might be able to do to explore that.
Yeah, and there's a range of things that you can do and a range of different strategies based on the exposure and vulnerability that exists at a particular property or for a particular asset. So there are some things that might be as simple as redirecting downspouts or managing where the snow piles up around your house, so that when we approach spring and we have some melting occurring, that you're reducing the likelihood of water getting into a lower level or a basement. Some of those things are pretty simple and provide immediate benefit. Then there's things that are a little bit more, might take a little bit more planning or resources. So putting in a drain tile and a sump pump might be really appropriate if you're exposed to a lot of groundwater seepage and you have a vulnerable block wall. That might be an option. And with like a sanitary backflow preventer, those things take a little bit more resources and you have to get a permit and likely a contractor to help you do those things. So there's kind of a range of things that can be really simple and immediate and cost very, very little or nothing. And then there's the things that take a little bit more planning and resources and a little bit more, you would need a permit and a contractor to help you with. Those are things for a structure. And then there's things at your property that you can do, things like rain barrels, rain gardens. And as I mentioned before, those things aren't going to solve all the flooding in the Morningside neighborhood. And we're not suggesting that, you're on your own and just get a bunch of rain barrels and the city's going to let you figure it out. That's certainly not what we're saying. But in the small storms, in an inch or a 2-inch rain that happens pretty frequently every year for a number of times, those things can really start to help at a hyper local scale. So there's things that you can do to kind of even reduce exposure to a shed or something in the backyard, or do your part to infiltrate water for a clean water benefit. So rain gardens and rain barrels do that also. If you can infiltrate water, especially on those frequent, really small storms, that can provide value, not as much in the flood risk reduction benefit, but in a one that promotes clean water.
So, can you talk a little bit about how often flooding actually occurs? And you talked about some of these larger events, but on a regular basis, like on a yearly basis, or if we're looking at maybe the life of a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, how much flooding are folks likely to see in that time frame?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we've kind of have this definition of, the likelihood of experiencing this type of event. So our 1% annual chance right now is we define that as 7.5 inches in a 24-hour period. And that, with climate change and at the pace of climate change that we're at, that might not even be accurate anymore. It might be more than that. So we're seeing more storms, more larger storms now than we have in the past. And so the information that we use to predict what those storm events will be, that information is already starting to get outdated. It only goes up to, I think, the early 2000s, perhaps. So that doesn't even incorporate the really recent patterns that we're seeing for climate change. So we might already even be behind on, and we have probably uh, we're using the same data, the most modern data out there, and it might already be becoming outdated because climate change is increasing precipitation rates so rapidly. So if we were to build infrastructure to handle a 1% annual chance storm now, in 10 years, in 20 years, it might be even more. And our infrastructure that we build today, will it be able to keep up in 10 years and in 20 years? We don't know, but the trend suggests that things are going to get worse as far as precipitation and flooding and flood risk.
Is there a correlation between flooding and groundwater? And is that at play in this? I know we're still looking at trying to understand the issue better. And can you talk about what kinds of things are you guys monitoring, and how are you monitoring those?
Yeah, the groundwater risk is one that I think kind of snuck up on people a lot. So when we think about flooding, I think the most typical initial thought is that overland surface flow, the stuff that comes over the land surface and into a window well or something like that. We've had so much rain over the last 6 years. It's been the wettest 6-year period. In 2019, we broke a record for precipitation. And that is starting to show up in the groundwater. We're seeing a rise in the groundwater table. And some of our watershed district partners have been monitoring groundwater wells, and they're seeing an increase in groundwater table elevations. So in some places, if the distance from your basement to the groundwater table is 10 feet, but the groundwater table has risen 10 feet or more, which in some places it has, then you might start to experience this groundwater seepage. So even if it's not raining, you might still notice that you're starting to see a little wet basement, or water is kind of coming into your basement. Or if you happen to have a drain tile and a sump pump, that perhaps your sump pump is running more frequently than it used to. So this spring, we haven't had as much rain as the past spring. However, we know that groundwater levels are high, and that trend, it's not the same everywhere. Groundwater is a really tricky thing to monitor and model, but we know in some places that it has increased by over 10 feet in some places. And so if you're close to the groundwater table, then that's certainly you might be seeing more groundwater seepage than perhaps 10 years ago or more. So in those instances, if you have a sump pump already, that's typically something that you would want to annually make sure that it's working properly. And make sure that you're replacing it. You know, they have a useful life sometimes of maybe 10 years. So make sure to check in on that too. That's a way to reduce vulnerability would be, you know, make sure that your sump pump is working, and then service it properly and replace it once it reaches the end of its life cycle.
Thanks, Jessica. I want to refocus a little bit more on how we're asking residents and community members to be involved in this process. What are the next steps? If I'm a homeowner, resident in Morningside, what are the next steps? What would you like me to do, and how do you want to hear from me in order to inform this process?
Yeah, good question. So on Better Together, that's where things you can do right now. We have a poll that's open, and we're going to leave that open for some time. So I foresee for a couple weeks, we're going to leave that open. A Q&A, I think that really helps us understand what you guys need to know in order to make a decision. So some examples, you know, we know cost is going to matter to people. What is each option going to cost? How much impact is this going to have on my street? How much impact is this going to have on the park? How much impact is this going to have on Weber Woods? How many trees might be impacted in Weber Woods with various options? Those are things that we expect people would need that information from us in order to weigh the trade-offs and make a decision. So asking questions helps us to understand kind of what people need to inform those questions, or you can just write out, tell us, I need to know this, this, and this, so that I can decide, you know, which alternative most fits in with my neighborhood and my values. So I think we're trying to figure out what information we need to give people so they can make decisions. And we also want to know what people value about this place. So tell us, you know, what is it that's really special about your neighborhood that we need to make sure that we accommodate as we're looking at a major infrastructure project? What things are have concerned you, or you've thought need to get fixed for a long time? Let us know, because there might be an opportunity to address that with this project. So things you could do tonight: take that poll, ask your questions, drop some pins on that map, and all of these things will be open for weeks to come, so you can keep filling us in. You could also give a call or send an email to any staff also at any time. So then the next steps, so we're going to be collecting this information about the neighborhood expertise for this next several weeks. At the same time, we're going to get to work on some of the engineering. So we've thought a little bit about this. We have some general ideas. We need to get a little bit more into the details and update some of our ideas with things that we learned through that flood risk reduction strategy task force process, to start to get a little bit better, more in focus on what those potential options are, or what those alternatives might look like. And those are going to be directly influenced by what we hear from the public. So the more we hear and the sooner, the better. You can certainly submit stuff at any time, but we're going to get to work shortly after this meeting here to start to put together some alternatives. And then in the fall, we're going to come back with our initial concepts, and they're going to be influenced by what we hear from the public. We're going to consider what we hear, and we're going to let you know how we used the feedback in formulating those initial concepts. And then we're going to get your reaction at that time. So we have not set a specific date for that initial concepts meeting yet, but we're looking at early September at this point. So that, of course, we'll get that into focus soon, and we'll update this Better Together page with that specific date. At this point, we're going to plan for a virtual meeting, and then as circumstances allow, we will try to do an in-person meeting and replicate that experience on the website as much as we can. So that whether you're participating online or in person, your feedback carries the same weight.
So what I'm hearing you say, Jessica, is that right now we're looking for open-ended feedback about what people value at their neighborhood, what their experiences are, and just sort of their perspective in this area. And that will go through the summer through a variety of ways, online and in person, hopefully. And then you're going to use that input to inform the engineering decisions and come back to the community in like September or the fall, and then look for input again from them based on those recommendations. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. We'll take an initial guess at what we think might work for people based on what we hear in the fall, and then we'll take more feedback after that too. So we'll get your reactions. Once I understand that folks might be thinking, how I don't even know yet. Show me what you're thinking about. And we're still kind of really early in the process of just trying to figure out what's important to people and how they use the space. We don't have alternatives yet to share with you. That's something we're going to be working on between now and when we present those initial concepts. So tell us some stories and help us get a sense for what matters to you. And then you'll have a chance to really look at, side by side, what potential alternatives there are and the consequences of each one and the trade-offs of each one, so that you can tell us which one seems to fit most, or which ones we need to change or merge, or add this, remove that. Those are things that we're all still very much open to, and that's just the next level of detail at that present initial concepts stage.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm also wondering, so you mentioned hearing people's stories, that you guys have done some modeling and you have computers, very smart engineers and computers that are looking at that. But it sounds like you want to hear people's individual specific experiences about their unique locations, their nooks and crannies, what's going on the ground, and kind of be our eyes and ears for that information. How should they best communicate that with the team?
Yeah, and I think the best way to do that would be through storytelling and the map on Better Together. I think the benefit of having it on the website there is then people can kind of contribute to each other, or might spur other ideas or other conversation. You could certainly reach out via phone call, or even invite staff out to see your issue firsthand. All of those ways of participating carry the same weight. So if you prefer to meet personally or to chat over the phone, we welcome that way of engaging with you as well. But yeah, you're exactly right, Patty. We have a model that shows us where to expect flooding and what magnitude to expect flooding. And although we think it's pretty close and doing, it's not perfect. It's not the same as being on the ground and living in that place, or visiting that place, or even a day or 2 days or 3 days after a rain event, what that feels like. We don't know what it feels like to be in the neighborhood and to experience that, and to dread a 2-inch rainfall because you expect something to happen in your neighborhood. That's what we want to know, and that's something that a model can't tell us.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jessica. We're having some questions about some of the specific features, like how to add a pin to the map, for instance. So you need to be signed in as a user on the Better Together Dynasat site, correct, to leave that feedback and to pin and share that information, I believe.
Yep, we're asking people to register on the website to leave that feedback. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet about Better Together is when you register, then if there are updates or we need to send out information, that there's an option that we can send you project specific information if you're registered for this project. So if you want to get updates via email about the Morningside Neighborhood Project, or when this page changes or new polls show up, or when we post the initial concepts or a new video, by registering on the site, then you get notified of those things, and we can get more information out to you via email.
And that, you said that's on the Better Together webpage. Can you show us where you go to sign up for updates?
So I'm not sure if I have the register button because I'm already signed in. I don't know, but I can make sure that we've got some directions and we can post that on how to register.
So I believe it's right above the who's listening on the right-hand side. So
Okay.
when you go to the project page, you should be able to sign up at a button at the top right. So you're signed
Yeah.
in. Can you perhaps go to the drop a pin map and sort of so we can see a little bit more what that process would look like?
Yep. So on this Better Together Morningside page, I can scroll down here to the map tab. And then on the map tab, I can open up this interactive map for this neighborhood. And then under this plus sign, I can click add pin. And if I have a specific, let's say I'm going to drop a pin for recreation and say, let's see. I need to drag it. There we go. And let's just say, I'm going to say this is, put my name on here just so that we know later who it came from. I think it would show my name anyway, and say, I like to picnic here. It's soggy after a storm often. I don't know, but just as an example. And then you can submit that. And then that will be available for anyone to see. To see that comment and to comment on it. So you can say, yeah, me too. I've experienced that same thing. Or I've noticed that, 3 days after a storm that there's this condition or that's something like that.
And we'll take a look at it and make sure that everything's working properly. If you do have any issues, you can email, people can email you and give you that feedback to make sure that it's recorded. Do you think that would, if they're having any issues, should they contact you, or is there a city desk or something?
You can certainly contact me, and my information is on the front of that project page right here, jwilson@edinmn.gov, and I will help you make sure that your information, your feedback is getting added to the map.
And you're going to, all this information is being collected in one place, right? So there'll be a written, transparent record of all the information that you received during this outreach engagement process.
Yep, absolutely. And we want to try to capture as much as we can on this Better Together page. And this will also act as the archive for this project. So as decisions are made, as concepts are shown, all of that stuff will be archived and available here. So you at any time can go back, even with this video, can go back and rewatch it. That's not to say that other modes of submitting feedback aren't welcomed. So if you make community comment at a city council meeting, if you send an email, if you make a phone call, all of those things carry the same weight. We are going to try to capture a lot of those ideas here in one place so that we can have a robust discussion and everyone can get a sense for what their neighbors and staff and council are thinking and feeling about the project. The more we can make public and transparent, the better those conversations will be.
I see we have another comment on Better Together with a more specific location. This person is inviting staff to come out to take a look at the site. That is something that your team would be willing to do if people have unique circumstances that they want to share with you.
Yep, certainly. And those are things where you can certainly submit that in a Q&A and we will follow up with you. And you can certainly email or call directly if you don't want to be putting your address onto the Better Together page. You could certainly reach out directly to a staff person, and then we'll work with you to find a time that makes sense. Right now, staff are following the social distancing recommendations too, so we respect that people might be a little bit uneasy about having us come out and visit, and we are very much sensitive to that, and we have some strategies to accommodate that and do it safely, and still be able to come out and hear people out.
And speaking of that, I just want to go back and plug the field activity again. That's going to be available for residents in mid-May, just to help people better understand what the different flooding options are and where those flood lines might be, and get outside and away from their computer. And that will be in Weber Park, and more information about that activity will be online on the Better Together website, and that'll be just a good way to connect with the space. And we really want to know what you value about the space. And that kind of leads me into, I was wondering, Jessica, if you could talk a little bit more about the trade-offs. You talked about knowing what's important to the community and what they value and how that might factor into decisions. So what are those kinds of, what are you looking at? Are there some areas that might, I guess maybe can you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so some of those might be, if we were going to, just for example, in Weber Park, increase surface storage, and add a place for floodwater to be stored in Weber Park or Weber Woods. That might mean there would be some impacts to a lawn space that people might be using for recreation or spiritual reflection, or whatever you're using that space for. We want to make sure that we understand how that space is being used, so that if a change occurs there, that the community understands what the consequence of like removing an area of lawn would be. Or perhaps another option might impact some mature trees in Weber Woods, and we want to be able to tell you, how many trees are going to be impacted and what space. There will be consequences and trade-offs for each alternative. This is a challenging space. It's fully built out. The amount of water we're talking about is pretty big, and the public space is a little bit limited. So there's not a lot of really easy, obvious solutions. Many of them come with some consequences and trade-offs. And so knowing that people are going to have to make some decisions there and decide, what, with open space, with cost, with impacts to parks or impacts to streets. Another potential option might be to have a street be a little lower or maybe a little bit deeper, so that it can carry some of that flood water in a storm. Are we okay with that? We want to know from you. So for each alternative, we'll describe the benefit that would accumulate, but then also the trade-off that you're making. So if we can store a lot of water in Weber Park and it might reduce flood risk by so much, that might mean that you're also going to lose some trees or maybe some lawn space. Is that a trade-off that you're willing to make? So that's, we recognize that people need some information in order to make those trade-offs, but we also want to let you know right off the bat, this is a tough problem to solve, and so none of them come without trade-offs.
Thanks, Jessica. So just to recap, the next steps here are we're going to post this meeting on Better Together so that folks can rewatch or share with their neighbors, and this will live on for folks to kind of get up to date with where we're at. But we'll continue to take comments and answer questions on the site. The project team will keep monitoring it. So this isn't your only chance to ask questions, and you can look for responses there. We'll also get back to folks on more specific individual issues and site specific questions. We'd ask that you take the poll that's available there. That really helps us get a better idea of your experiences. And we want to hear your stories. Share with us, how long have you lived here, and what has your experience been with flooding? Is there anything you've done that's helped? Has it gotten worse over time? What are you seeing from your neighbors? Those are the kinds of things that we want to know. And then share that information on the interactive map as well. Is there anything you'd add, Jessica?
I think a lot of this project is based on the expertise of the stakeholders. So I want to make sure that people really feel like they are really understand the contribution that they can make here. So there's specific roles that different stakeholders play, right? I know a lot about flooding and water resources management. I don't know anything about what it's like to live in the Morningside neighborhood and what it feels like to be on that street and to experience a flood event. And I think that's a really important part of engineering a solution. So I want to make sure that people really know that we genuinely care about what you think. This is it's not too early to start to tell us what you think and what you value, so that we put that into the engineering that we're doing. I think also this is our first go under the flood risk reduction strategy, so we have a lot to learn, and engagement flood risk reduction can be an emotional conversation, because some people do experience some damage and disruption, and we want to hear you out on that. We genuinely want to see what is possible for addressing your issue. So we need to hear from you. Let us know what you think, so that we can incorporate your voice as we explore options here. Engagement is a little bit messy, but we are ready to embrace it and lean into it and learn from you as we go. So I want to thank people too at the beginning of this process for getting in the mix. I know it takes some effort to participate, and you're taking time out of your lives to give us some feedback, and so we really value it, and thank you from the start for helping us with this project.
I want to echo, Jessica, that flooding, it is an issue that does cause a lot of anxiety. I know that I personally have had some basement flooding, and it's it does impact you, and it does every time it rains, and you think, oh, is this going to take over my day? So we do understand that this is a real issue that affects you, and we do appreciate your feedback and your input. And again, sign up for those updates when there's more opportunities, when we have more information or more ways for you to give your input. We'll let you know. You probably won't get something every week, but we'll make sure to reach out when there's more things. The Better Together site will continue. It's a living site, so we'll continue to post things there and give you opportunities to participate. The field activities coming up, and that'll be a great way for you to plug into the project and continue to send your feedback to us, and tell your neighbors about it. We want to hear from them too. So we really appreciate your time and all of your input. And I just want to thank you for sharing your night with us.
Thank you, everybody.